and asking the question, how productive are they? It's been a matter of much discussion and debate, in part prompted by the release of the latest local productivity data by the ONS, which now gives us about 20 years worth of data to look at how our big cities have been performing over that period. And obviously there are connections to the devolution debate and discussion as well. So lots of interest in what this tells us. And this briefing really thinks about and focuses on big cities. If you're a follower of the Centre of the City, which I assume many of you are, you know that big cities and big city productivity has been a focus for us for a very long time, because it's important, obvious thing to say. It's important to those cities. It's important to the MCAs that those big cities are in, and it's also important to the national economy as well. So there's lots of interest around this particular issue, and it's something that we've spent a lot of time working on over the years. So the way we're going to do it is, in a moment, the co-author of the briefing, my colleague Yunze Wang, is going to take us through the slides and try to provide some headlines and some narrative around the report itself. Obviously, the report is on our website, centreofcities.org, plus other material. His slides will take about 25 minutes, and then I'll be joined by Yunze and by my colleague Anne Breach, and we'll have a bit of a conversation, but also importantly take your questions and or comments, which you can put into the Q&A function at any time. So you can submit your questions now or during or after you've heard from Yunze. You can submit your questions. You can also vote using the thumbs up button to vote on other people's questions, the ones that you particularly like. They will appear at the top of my viewing, so I'll try to keep an eye on those as well. But as I said, the more questions and comments we get, then hopefully we'll get through them in the second half of proceedings. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Yunze, who's the lead author on the briefing. He's going to take us through the findings and tell us a bit of the story, and then we'll come back together and have a bit of a discussion on some of the specifics. So Yunze, over to you.
All right, thank you, Andrew. So as Andrew has mentioned, this slideshow is really a sort of summary and overview of our briefing on productivity. So there's a lot. This is a very chart heavy and footnote heavy briefing. So for a lot of the more detailed and nuanced discussions, please do go to the briefing itself. This is more of a sort of a overview of the larger findings, as well as a narrative we think that are emerging from this data. So the first thing to know is we want to explain what exactly is productivity. This is obviously a very important statistics. Essentially, what it is it's about how much economic output you can produce with 1 unit of labor. That sounds a little bit abstract, but essentially it is, in mathematical terms, it is your economic output, which is typically measured as gross value added, GVA, divided by labor inputs in the form of jobs or hours. We'll mostly be focusing on hours because it is the preferred method to document labor inputs. Something else that's worth noting is that we're working with what is known as sub-regional productivity, which is essentially productivity of places across the country. Now, something important to remember is that this is not a independent data from the national productivity. What I mean by that is essentially what the Office of National Statistics does is that it has a national figure and it's sort of a national GVA and labor inputs and portioned down to specific places. So in practice, if you're looking at productivity of Leeds or Manchester, we're not building them from ground up. We're not building separate data sets for Leeds or Manchester, but we are portioning national figures down to these localities. As Andrew has mentioned, this data has now, like the newest edition covers 2023. So we have data over a period of 20 years from 2004 to 2023. So this is the sort of background of where this briefing comes from. And one more thing I want to know before we go into the graphs is the larger framework we're approaching this is one of productivity gap between London and other cities, large cities. By what I mean, there has been a sort of a long-term persistent, London has essentially been ahead on productivity against some of the other secondary large cities of the UK for a long time now. And this has implications nationally because the lag behind of some of our large cities, again, behind London, is a key constraining factor to the national economy. So this is something that we've always looked out for, and this is something we've been looking out for in this particular data and in this briefing. So this is the background information we're working with, and we're going to now move on to each of the findings we have. First, to start with exactly what the official data is showing. As I mentioned, there will be a lot of graphs, so don't worry, I'm going to walk you through each one. So this one, what it's essentially showing is GVA per hour, which is, as I mentioned, is how we measure productivity from 2004 all the way to 2023. This is indexed to 2004, which means that like we held like 2004 as 100, and all figures after is that essentially like how much has grown from 2004. This is to give us a better view of like movement without movement, like how fast each place is growing. So we have three different places, what should I say, categories of places here. So we have the UK, we have London, and we have large cities. Now, the interesting thing here, as you can see from the dotted line on 2019, is that 2019 serves as a threshold. So before 2019, there's very slow growth in productivity, and the three places we're looking at are like relatively coupled together. They move sort of in tandem. This is true before 2019, especially true in like from like after financial crisis leading up to 2019. But afterwards, you can see there is a new trend emerging, which is a large cities, so marked by the dark green line, is really outperforming both the country as a whole, but particularly London. In fact, it's growing faster than it was before 2019, while London is sort of stagnant. In practice, this means that the productivity growth of these two categories of places are decoupling. Now, the next graph will sort of show you what it means city by city. This is all the big cities plus London, and this is not showing the productivity anymore. It's showing the annual growth rate of productivity, where we've broken it down into three time periods of post 2019 because that's like where that trend is emerging. For the pre-2019 period, we've broken it down at 2012, so it's 2004 to 2012 and 2012 to 2019 to account for the fact that in some places the trend seemed to have been changed by the financial crisis. So yeah, each color is a different time period, and as you can see, the x-axis is all the cities. And the key takeaway from here is really that a lot of large cities are doing quite well in the official data since 2019. There's some variations in there, but in 7 out of the 10 places we're looking at, they're growing like faster annually than what you record than ever in recorded data. 3 particular places are doing particularly well. That's Leeds, Liverpool, and Manchester. And in comparison, London is relatively stagnant. This was so somewhat before 2019 and definitely true after 2019. So when you think about these two category places, London versus other big cities, you have other big cities sort of catching up, was London staying essentially where it was. What this means is that the sort of gap I mentioned earlier, the persistent productivity gap between London and other large cities actually appear to be narrowing for the first time in quite a long time. Again, this graph is sort of showing that gap. Same x-axis is still the same time period. What is doing is line is collectively all the other non-London big cities bundled together. This is their productivity, but indexed to London, which means that like if London is 100 and in each year for each data point, then what is what percentage of London are all the big cities grouped together. So basically, as you can see, the green line gets close to 100. That means the gap is narrowing. So the key again, the key thing I think everybody can see here is that after 2019, this sort of convergence between the productivity of the two category places are really picking up. So like if you see before 2019, there's been essentially no narrowing. That the gap has been very consistent, particularly since 2012. But after 2019, this narrowed by 5% point was in the span of 5 years. Now, this is quite unusual. This will be in some ways welcome news. As I said, large cities catching up will be a good thing for the national economy, but this is a quite dramatic change from before, which is why we thought it was worth investigating this data further. And the method we've chosen to do so is, as I mentioned, productivity is derived by dividing GVA by labor inputs. So we are actually able to investigate both components separately to see exactly which of these two, or maybe both, are driving this new trend in productivity of large places. So first, we'll be looking at GVA. So this is the sort of numerator of the productivity calculation. That's the economic output being divided. So this is the same 3-time period. On the x-axis, this is annual growth in this time this is not annual growth in productivity anymore, but specifically in GVA. So your economic output. And I've grouped that by the categories places. So you used to get London, large cities. We've put in some other places for reference, as well as Great Britain. So what you can see here is really that, like, if you focus on the difference between 2012 to 2019 and 2019 to 2023, nationally, a lot of productivity, a lot of places has slowed growth in a lot of not productivity. The GVA growth in a lot of places has somewhat slowed down. The only exception are the large cities. You can see the dark green bar there between the two time periods. They have essentially stayed the same. Now, what this means is that comparatively, these large cities are contributing more to the national economy than before. This is quite unusual. There's limited data on like how we can. There's limited ways we can deconstruct this GVA data further to see exactly what's driving it. But ultimately, like, an unusual pattern does not make the data any less valid. We think this is large. We have no reason essentially to question this GVA data.
Yeah.
Now, now, so the next element is the labor input data. So this is looking at the same time period, but this is national aggregated data now. We're looking so specifically we're looking at jobs. As I said, like, hours are generally preferred, but hours are derived from jobs, so any movement in jobs will be reflected in hours. So this is why we're looking at the jobs data. And specifically, we're breaking it down into the two main categories, which are like company employees versus people who are self-employed. And collectively, they, along with some smaller categories, make up the whole jobs category of the for productivity calculations. So this is looking at, so the green bar is all of the annual growth of all jobs, whereas the blue and the mint-ish color are the two categories. What you can see here is that self-employment has become quite dramatically since 2019, has grown sort of faster than company jobs, but now it's falling at like more than 6% a year. And there's some theories as to why this is. Some of it is that like the COVID period and the government furlough scheme made people reevaluate whether they're really self-employed for tax purposes. But as you can, so the series, a lot of people actually are stating the same job. They just reclassify themselves as company employees. The issue with that is, as you can see, there's not a corresponding growth in company employees. And so like in aggregate, when you put them together, your overall job number is still quite affected by this drop in self-employment. So when you sort of look at or combine these two things together, you get a interesting image. So this graph is a little bit complicated. So I will just walk you through that. So on the x-axis is the annual GVA growth rate from 2019 to 2023. On the y-axis is the hours growth rate. So if your GVA is essentially growing faster than your hours, then your productivity will be going up because you're producing more output but not matched up by equal increase in labor. And the size of the bubble are sort of how fast the productivity is growing, green being positive and purple being negative. So what you can see here is that, especially for the three places that are growing quite fast, that it's Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds, they have this combination of faster relatively fast GVA growth, but also like decline in labor input. So mathematically, by definition, you will have a much larger productivity growth. This is, again, quite a bit unusual. So you essentially are saying, oh, the economies actually are expanding, but some of the labor market inputs are shrinking. And this is particularly like of note because unlike the GVA data, we do think there are some ways to verify how much the self-employment data is genuine movement. And specifically, we can contrast that with HMRC data. So this is what this graph is showing for each year, how many self-employed people there are by methodology. So the lighter green bar is the annual population survey, which is essentially asking people, are you self-employed? Whereas, and this is somewhat basically feeds into productivity calculation. And you have the darker green bar, which is the HMRC self-assessment assessment data. So this is admin data. This is like how many people have filed taxes in a way that would make them self-employed for tax purposes. As you can see here as you can see, so the light green bar is always higher. This is because some people like see themselves as self-employed, but they pay taxes in a way that don't necessarily that like are more compatible with company employees. But the key thing here is that the dark green bar is not moving all that much. Yet the light green bar is sort of starting a steady decline since 2019. So with this, this means that like the data movement in the labor force surveys are not being reflected in real life by some of the other admin data. And this is building up on the fact that there has been some growing concerns around labor market data from the ONS due to falling response rate. So all of that combined means that there's probably some genuine inconsistencies in the way that we're using this that impacts that sort of adds more uncertainty into our productivity data. And let me show you what this means. So this graph is showing showing like sort of the impact of this decline in self-employment. So the light green bar is essentially what's happening to total hours worked since 2019. This is official data. The darker green bar is what would happen if we hold self-employment at 2019 level. As you can see across the board, there's the adjusted this adjustment would increase hours worked quite substantially, across all cities. In a lot of places, hours worked will go from decline to actually growth. So there's a directional change. And in some places, even if they were originally growing, this would essentially double their growth rate. And all this means is that the adjustment would be quite substantial if we assume, as the HMRC data says, self-employment has held at 2019 level. This will have a quite substantial impact on the hours work data, which would mean this will have a quite substantial impact on the productivity data. So this is a similar graph, but instead of showing sort of what would happen to hours growth in hours worked, this is showing what would happen to productivity. So light green bar is data that we've shown before, which is the official data, how much the annual growth rate of productivity year on year since 2019 in all places. The darker green bar is the sort of the same adjustment, like what would the productivity look like if self-employment has held at 2019 level? And you get the two dotted line, which is the sort of the GB average, just for reference. And something I want to note, a very important thing about this data is that we're not saying the darker green bar is in alternative sets of productivity. We're not saying actually this is your new productivity data now. Surprise, you're doing worse than you thought. That's not what we're saying at all. What we're saying is, well, we know there's some inconsistency, some uncertainty in the labor force data. What would that mean for the uncertainty in our productivity data? So this is not alternative data. This is more of a stress testing how productivity data will respond to sort of any adjustment in labor market data. And what would happen here is that you get more variation across different cities. So some cities could possibly be looking at stagnation or decline. But again, this is more of a range than a new set of data. The three strong performers: Leeds, Liverpool, Manchester. They're still doing quite well, though there's a substantial cut to the productivity growth rate. And going back to the story about convergence, that is the fact that big cities are catching up to London in terms of productivity, that would still be happening in this graph. The difference is that the large cities are going a little bit slowly, but at the same time, London is declining more noticeably. So the convergence will still be happening, but London's decline would be a little bit more prominent, a more prominent contributing factor than the growth or sort of catching up of large cities. And this does matter because overall convergence is a good thing, but you kind of want the one lag behind to be sort of catching up rather than the one ahead to be falling behind. So yeah, this is what we think the uncertainty in the labor force data mean for productivity. So we can see there's a little bit more uncertainty in the productivity data as well. So I want to end this with like what this all means. So, and I will break this down into like for in terms of data and in terms of policy. So for data, the ONS is already working on improving some of the labor market data. So we are hopeful they can make some improvement to this. In the meantime, I think the GVA data, as I mentioned, there's not actually a lot of way to scrutinize this independently, but I think the ONS could allow that to be allow a little bit more transparency. There's some data sets in the GVA calculation that are not public for very legitimate reasons that concern business privacy. But in those cases, then the ONS should be a little bit more proactive in explaining why it thinks there's some new development in the way the different regions of the country are fare against compare against each other. And overall, we just think that sub-regional data should become more of a priority for the ONS. Obviously, the national headline figures are important. It's used for a lot of policy decision making, but I think it's fair to say a lot of regional policymakers, people who work in local authorities, this is a very important data for all of us. So having confidence in that data is very important for our day-to-day work. And as for policymakers, if the GVA data is in any way reliable, there is a productivity convergence between London and other large cities. What we don't know right now is to what extent that is because of other large cities catching up, or London sort of falling behind. So without knowing that, we need to sort of take that uncertainty into account in our sort of policy making. So if you're a policymaker, just apply a little bit more caution when interpreting or using the recent productivity data. Like we think the general trends appear to be genuine, but But yeah, there's more certainty around the specific figures. So if you are making policies based on this, maybe like don't rely solely on this data, sort of corroborate that with other data sources you have. So that is sort of overview. As again, this is a broad overview for a briefing. If you want any more details, do check it out.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Yunze. If you could stop sharing, good. So magically, in a moment, Yunze and my colleague Ampreach are going to join me in the seats next to me. I think it's important to say, while I'm waiting for them to make their way in, this is a bit unusual for us. Again, if you know our work, in the way that Yunze set out the analysis that is in the report, and more broadly, if you look at the report, you can rightly criticize us for hedging. We are hedging our bets at this moment in time in terms of what the data is telling us or not. And I think there are three reasons why we're hedging at this moment in time. The first reason is because, as we've seen, some of the changes, particularly from 2019, are quite big, and they're different from what's gone in the past. So that's an important point, that the data is suggesting something significant is happening. That's the first reason. The second reason is because it's important. As I said at the beginning, the performance of our big cities is a national issue. It's not just a local issue. And so we need to be very mindful of that. So it's an important consideration rather than not. No disrespect to smaller places, but if they're growing really fast or shrinking really quickly, has less of a national impact. It really does matter to us what's going on in London and what's going on in Manchester, etc. And the third thing, which Yunze described explicitly and implicitly, is because of the degree of uncertainty with the data itself. So we have to be mindful about those three things, which really, as I said, is unusual for us in that we're hedging. And if anyone says, let me be a bit bolder on this now, anyone says they're categorically clear as to what's happening at the local level in terms of economic performance, I would suggest that you don't take them seriously, right? They may have whatever they might have, but strongly held views in this scenario at this moment are probably not that helpful, which is why, I'd say, unusually, we're hedging in some respects and actually saying there is more consideration, more discussion, more investigation that needs to happen. So just bear all of that in mind, because we can see in some of the questions, people already suggesting plausible, they're all plausible reasons as to why the data is performing the way it is. I'm not disagreeing with anything you've said, but the part of the answer is we need to do a bit more work around this kind of stuff. And that's partly about working with the ONS on that. So that's just a bit of a preamble. So you put your questions in, use the thumb to vote for your favorite, as well as obviously vote for your own. They will appear at the top of my questions, and I will have a look at those. So as you can see, and Yunze have now joined me. And we heard a lot from Yunze in the presentation, lots of charts, lots of data, lots of detail. Yes. Just for the purpose of, what are the three things that you would particularly want to re-emphasize, just to hammer home to the watching audience?
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks, Andrew. So I mean, there's three things that kind of stand out to me, some which Yunze touched on, some which he didn't. I think the first thing is that the definition of the geography you use will matter quite a bit for the size of the effect that you'll get and the trajectory of the growth rates. So obviously we're using our primary urban area definition, which is pretty close to the combined authority or metro mayor definition in some places. It's a little bit wider in other places, and you'll definitely see some variation between kind of what the metro mayors are doing and this definition as a result. So bear that in mind. Second is that kind of that final point you ended on, Andrew, about how if these trends are real, it's not going to be just one thing, right? There's going to be a mix of things kind of affecting local economic productivity, both in a positive direction and also a negative direction. And it's just going to take time for this all to become clear and confident to external audiences as well, I think probably as some of the practitioners. And I think the third thing is, if true, the implications of this are quite profound, right? That if we are seeing for the first time in decades, real economic convergence across the country, that will change the economic and social character of the country. And that's why this question and why this debate is so important.
Yeah, that's very good. So we've got lots of different questions coming in. Some of them are asking about what do we think are some of the reasons behind the trends, which I've just talked about. You know, some saying, well, you know, it's well known that we get, you know, skill bias changes in the economy. It's driven by kind of those at the higher end of the skill spectrum, possibly. Yunze, you can say something about that when we get into the GVA data and look at what's driving some of that performance. Some of that is true, but some of that is less true, depending on which cities you're looking at. So just unpack that. Just say a little bit about, without going into loads of detail, when we unpack some of the components, particularly GVA, where can we see some of this growth coming from?
Yes, so there is data that sort of break down the headline GVA number at local level further into different sectors. And the key thing here is, and I think I touched on it a little bit, is that the big cities are sometimes quite different in their current trajectory. So if you look at, I think, two of the strongest performers, you have Leeds and Manchester, and in both of those places, based on the sort of sector-specific data, there are a lot of their growth do come from like sort of knowledge-intensive service sectors. So like think about like information communications, sort of like professional services. So there's so in these places their GVA growth seems to be driven by that. It's a slightly different story in Liverpool. You see some of those sectors doing well as well, but there's more contribution from, for example, the education sector or the real estate sector. So really, like each city has a somewhat different story. With a noted caveat that like the more you break down these data, the sort of more noises there is. So like take that with a pinch of salt. But yeah, we think there's not like, this is sort of Ant's point, right? Like there's not like, if these movements are genuine, there will be sort of a confluence of a lot of factors. There's not like a single magical thing that's driving all of it, and that's playing out differently in each city and potentially in the different industries of each city.
Yeah, we've had another question around. Obviously, everybody will know 19 coincides with COVID, and that has obviously an economic shock. It's an economic shock. It appears also to have been a data shock as well, which we well know. A lot of the volatility and variance that we see is post-19, which is telling us something about, again, the national story about the LFS becoming much less reliable, plus other data sets after that period is well known. But more particularly, I think there's a question around the COVID effect. For example, is London's decline or stagnation due to the fact that everybody left London, they now work somewhere else, or they live somewhere else, but they still work in London, and therefore, so you can deal with that because that's not the reason. But you can say well, it's in a bit more detail, Yunze.
So I think in general, like it's not wrong to say that like COVID has like given a shock to both to the economy and to like the data collection. So there is a lot of noise in that data. Specifically on whether or not London's decline will be because of people moving out. So again, going back to the sector-specific GVA data, something that we look at is that in London, the case is that since 2019, of that decline happens in like more sort of local service-oriented sectors. So there's some decline in retail, there's some decline in transportation, as well as like health. So it's difficult to sort of like entirely look at that and say, oh, this is definitely because of people moving out. And also interestingly, London is London's like is one like if you look at sort of the labor aspect of it, yes, like if you held like what we did with self-employment, we will be adjusting London's labor inputs further up. But even in the official data, London's number of jobs, that hours worked, they're still growing at a relatively like stable rate.
Yeah, I mean, just to zoom out from that a bit, obviously both will have an effect on the data and the actual performance of London. We still can't untangle how much of those is one or the other. but certainly our earlier research on this question, our paper Capital Losses, showed that London's been having productivity challenges since at least the financial crisis. And what's striking is it's not just one thing, right? The immediate reaction to that from people is, oh, it's just the financial sector is in trouble, everything else is doing fine. No, there's quite broad problems across London that are quite persistent. And I think this gets into, I think, some of the kind of politics around this situation, which is over the past kind of 10, maybe 15 years, the national debate has almost taken London for granted a little bit. And there's just been this assumption that London is doing really well, London is really rich, we can just let London kind of chug away and focus on the problems outside the capital cities. What this research shows, and indeed what our other research shows, is that London is really starting to face some quite severe challenges. And if politicians think that London was perhaps a golden goose, London today might be something of a kind of a silver goose, in that it's still leading productivity growth. It's still the single most important national local economy in the national economy, but it faces real challenges that require politicians who are not in London to pay attention and to care about the performance of this local economy for the sake of the entire country.
Yeah, we'll come back to that in a second. Just a little detour, because we've got several questions on this. This report focuses on big cities. It's in the title. Apologies. We've had several questions about other places, not least from people like, what about Brighton? What about Cardiff? What about Edinburgh? What about somewhere else? Obviously, we've got all the data on those sorts of places as well. We will do the work in due course on all of those other places and lay it out. So by very definition, we're focusing on what the big cities are doing, in part because, as I said, they have a national significance, which is outweighed beyond just their local significance, to really understand what's going on in those places. And yes, as John, Neil and others have said, there are sectoral differentiation between these places. You can see that in the GVA data. All of that is kind of been unpacked and unpicked in order to try and understand what's going on in these places. But at the end of the day, when you take a place-based perspective, you're aggregating that up to understand how the place is performing, as well as what individual sector X or individual activity Y, right? You have to take a place-based perspective, which is really what we're doing and what we've always done in many respects, which is really important.
100%. Places are not just the sum of their individual sectors, right?
Yeah.
How places perform is what the data is telling us, and the sectors add insight to that, but certainly just looking at sectors alone can't explain all of these trends.
Yeah. Danny K, London, silver goose on its way to becoming a dead parrot. You put a question mark at the end of that, Danny. I don't know what you want us to respond to, but it's the fair point, which is Ant's point, which is we've taken London's outperformance for a very long time. As we know, it's 20, 21, 22% of the national economy. So if and when it does badly, which it has done for a while, that has national implications, not just local implications, whether it's a parrot or a goose or an eagle or whatever it might be. I'll leave others to decide.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's just really sort of looking into this data really closely kind of brought home to us is it's really quite difficult for the national economy to do well when the country's largest and most important local economy is doing badly.
Yeah. And so we've had a few questions, so it's probably worth you said it, but let's just say it again in relation to the shifts around self-employment, right? Because part of it is a reclassification, which you talked about, which is those that thought they were or claimed to be self-employed when they were asked to fill in their tax reforms, particularly to access furlough, reclassify themselves to become employees. But it's not just that. The point you're making is actually the data seems to have lost an awful lot of people, not just through reclassification, they've actually been lost in the system. So just re-emphasize that point, because that's the labor adjustment that we're trying to make in an imperfect and imprecise way.
Yeah, so there's two things I think that's notable. First is that in that decline of self-employment, the first thing is that there is a genuine movement of people sort of reclassifying themselves from self-employment to being company employees, and this is partially because I think because the COVID furlough scheme sort of depending on whether you are self-employed for tax purposes, you receive very different level, different type of help. So a lot of people sort of aligned themselves more with the tax definition. There is movement there. The second point is that this doesn't fully address the problem though, because if this is the one-on-one switch, what you would expect to see is that on the company employee side, from the labor force survey or annual population survey, you will get those people going into the company employees. You will see at least for a couple of years, like a sort of a bump in that company employee data. But we're not seeing that. The company employee data is growing, but it's growing at sort of a baseline rate that's quite consistent with what was happening before. So when you put these two things together, which are again the vast majority of the labor force, in aggregate you're still missing, I think, close to 1 million people in the APS data set, and that has obviously knock-off effect on productivity because the LFS APS data feeds into productivity.
Yeah, which raises an interesting dynamic in some respects, because as you showed in one of the charts, in some places, Leeds, Manchester, Liverpool, the most obvious ones, what you can see is GVA is growing and actually the workforce is shrinking, right?
Yeah.
Now, that's obvious. Right? If your workforce shrinks and your GVA grows, by definition, it's just a statistical artifact, you get productivity growth. But if that is true, genuinely true, then we've got a labour market question to ask, right? Which is, where are these people and why is the labour market shrinking in places relative to what it was in 19? So it's an interesting, different set of consideration, which then has implications for a whole bunch of other policy-related questions around skills, health, et cetera, et cetera. So as always, it's whack-a-mole, right? You deal with one issue, you think, oh, productivity growth is really, really strong. But if it's driven by a shrinking workforce, then you need to be worried about a shrinking workforce in some respects.
So it's a bit like kind of some of the differences you see between British and French productivity, right? Which is French productivity is much higher than British productivity. That is partly because their unemployment rate is much higher, right? We have more lower productivity workers who are in our labour market, who are doing perhaps better or worse than their kind of French counterparts. But that has an effect on the national aggregated productivity statistics because the composition of the labour market is slightly different. If part of what we're seeing here is that the labour markets of these big cities have changed in a way that people are exiting the labour market, that is not necessarily good productivity growth in the way that local and national policymakers might like.
Yeah. We've had a few questions, several questions on, so it says, what does this mean? And what they particularly are asking, which is, well, this is good news for Leeds, it's good news for Manchester, good news for Liverpool, etc., good news for Sheffield, etc., etc. Not so good news for everywhere else, right? We can immediately, go, well, this is good, but what about everywhere else? And I think it's important, and you can say some of it, it's important to emphasize that even if this is true, this performance that we observe in the data is true, the minute we take it at face value, it's fragile, right? And relatively short-lived, which you could see in the convergence data. So again, yes, if we see better performance, let's just be mindful that we need this to go on for 20 years, right? At least to see, to get the bigger national improvements that we want to make before getting diverted to go somewhere else.
Absolutely. I mean, if you take Manchester as an example, right? Manchester's renaissance is decades in the making.
Yeah.
Right? And the fact that we have only now just seen, after years and years and years of work, a real burst of convergence between Manchester and the national economy, I think clearly screams that we're going to need to have a longer period of this for this to translate into sustained and permanent improvements in living standards and economic performance in every part of the country.
Yeah, Yunze.
Just adding on that, I think there's also important to keep in mind sort of like in terms of movement versus stock issue. So this briefing is focused on sort of movement in productivity.
Rates and levels.
Yes.
Rates and levels.
How much it has grown. But if you look at the actual productivity level, not how much the percentage at which it's grown, like London, yeah, it's stagnant, but it's still one of the most productive places. Whereas, yes, you can see Manchester and Leeds catching up, but bear in mind they are starting from a much lower base, and also they are, even after all these years, they're still only catching up to the national average. When ideally for big cities that size, we should expect them to be above national average. So there's there's some welcoming trends, you can say, for some of our large cities, but there's a long way to go there.
Yeah, double down rather than think job done.
Yeah.
Right. This is a classic policy characteristic in the UK. We observe something happening, it's broadly positive, we think the job is done, and we move on to something else. The job is definitely not done, as you said. You can see at best, the average of our large cities relative to London is about 75%, give or take, and it's gone up a little bit in the more recent past, but it's been fairly stable up until that point. We want to close that gap even more, and as we show in the paper, the gap closure is as much to do with London's bad performance as it is to do with the big cities' good performance. Right?
I think the other challenge here, right, it's kind of, as the questions are saying, good news for one place then also means bad news for a different place. And thinking about these very large geographic divides we have across the country, overcoming those means that the big cities will become more different to each other over time than they currently are. They are all currently in a broadly similar economic position, broadly because they all underperform. And if some of them start to pull away and start to lead the national economy, they will become more varied and more different. Part of how, and that will present national political challenges, of course. Part of how we have to manage that nationally as a country is we have to advance devolution and give all of the big cities the powers, the resources, and the financial incentives to pursue local growth in their own cities, not just for their own residents, but for the sake of the national economy.
Yeah. So you've had, again, a few questions on what are these places doing well? Like as humans, we always look for the reason to tell the story behind. We see something happen, we need to make an argument as to why it's happened. There's some human endeavor in that. But just a point, Yunze, because actually, when you look at the GVA growth, so Becky says, well, look, the financial services industry in Leeds is doing relatively well. It's actually been growing. They've been attracting new activities in. You can see that to a degree in Manchester. Actually, the GVA data seems to support that to a degree, right?
Yeah.
There is something in the data that supports the observed, what we see on the ground.
So I think two things about that. First is, yes, it is true. So specifically, we're looking at some of the strong performers since 2019. A lot of it it's not just financial services, like sort of like the knowledge-intensive service sector in general. So like think about like information, like people in tech, or as well as other kind of professional services. So there is definitely a story there about like these places doing well and attracting these businesses. The second point, though, is that we can look at sort of GVA growth through different sectors, and we can see some of them doing well. But ultimately, a lot of the strong performers are broad-based. In a similar way, some of the weak performers are like weak across the board. So I think there is a balance that we need to think about in terms of like attributing that to some sectors, which there's reason to do so, but also keeping in mind that a lot of these growths are quite broad-based.
Yeah.
They are occurring across different sectors. Yeah. So there's a sort of a general improvement rather than like specifically all of the growth comes from this one sector.
Yeah. So, and follow on from this, because this is one of a liked question, which is what impact then do you think the government's industrial strategy, which is focused on 8 specific sectors, might have on growth trajectories of different large cities? So, interestingly, the broad-based nature of what we see is a kind of interesting thing. We've done work, you can find it on our website, about how the IS8, to what degree they're prominent or not, or less prominent in different places. But actually, it talks to a broader agenda, which I'll come on to in a second, about how we think about growth beyond sectors.
Yeah, I think the more important aspect of the industrial strategy in this sense is the place pillar of the industrial strategy, in that the government has said as one of the 5 kind of principles, those 5 pillars, is to develop the potential and performance of the big cities as a way of improving the national economies, attractiveness to investment and to higher value, higher productivity activities. Now, what that means is then, whatever the case is for bespoke sectoral support by each of the IS8, actually the bread and butter work of improving transport within city regions, improving the commercial space offer, improving density along public transport corridors in many of these places. That seems to be where, certainly over the medium to long run, we would expect government policy to have an effect on improving the size of the labour markets in these places, improving the efficiency of these labour markets, and thereby improving the appeal of these places to this kind of highly innovative, highly productive, highly important economic activity that is rightly driving the government's industrial strategy.
Yeah, so let's just stay in this theme, because other analysis of the data has very closely, and a slightly different analysis, which focuses on how the combined authorities are doing rather than the big cities. And it's an important distinction to make, because the economic geography of the CAs themselves is noticeably different within even within the relatively small group. But there's been an understandable connection between the devolution agenda, which is getting on for, in a meaningful way, sort of 10 years now, since the first mayors, or nearly 10 years, and the first lots of deals, and obviously a more recent uptick in the performance. Causal effects, debatable, but you can see there's a sort of policy agenda, which goes back to my point about this is quite an important debate and discussion to get to understand as best as we can, because it has real world implications. If, as it looks, devolution is supporting improved big city productivity performance and growth performance more generally, that is a big win for devolution, right? I mean, it's a really important point to make, and we need to be mindful of that, but we also need, to a degree, to be reasonably sure about that. Just your thoughts on that?
No, absolutely. I mean, it comes back a little bit to this fragility point, right? That it seems like it might be true that there's this connection between increased devolution at the local level, stronger local leadership, and so this first time in decades, stronger local improvement in some of these places. How that agenda continues to evolve, how much trust the government puts in these mayoral institutions to continue changing their economies, and in particular thinking about what are the next kind of difficult conversations that need to happen across government and within places to really give the mayors the power that they need to change both the kind of the parts of their economy that are developing and doing well, but also spreading that prosperity out to the rest of the combined authorities. Are going to be a big priority for the next decade of devolution.
Yeah. Yunze, we're coming towards the end. So just repeat and reiterate, expand, what next? Particularly, we talked a little bit about what we would ideally want to see the ONS doing. We're very supportive of them. They're in a difficult position. We need to help them and support them to get out of the situation that they're in. In the context of the work that we've been doing and we are doing, just a reiteration really of how could we meaningfully help, and what would ONS need to do, or what could they do in order to facilitate and enable that help to happen?
Yeah, so I think something that's important to note is that, like, what we say, like, oh, there's some uncertainty in data, we don't mean like we're not saying, oh, like ONS made a mistake. That's not what's happening at all. In a lot of cases, it's genuine challenges in terms of, for example, like declining response rate to the labor force survey, and there's not much on the data, a statistical element that you can do to counter that. So I think in terms of specifically what the ONS could be doing, there's a few things. The first thing is that really like resolving the labor force survey issues. Like I said, specifically the declining response rate. I think there is already some genuine effort in dealing with that. The ONS is trying to sort of improve the particular element. We're hopeful that this will be resolved in the near future. The second thing, specifically more pertaining to GBA, but more broadly, is that we think more data transparency would be helpful. So something that came up when we were trying to look into the GBA data is that there's somewhat limited ways of doing that, because a lot of as you can probably imagine, calculating the national GBA is a very, very complicated endeavor that involves a lot of data sets. So making them as accessible as reasonably they can, and could help like outside experts, like friends of the cities or from other places. We can help look into that and see, like, oh, if there's an interesting development, what is causing that, and do we think that is genuine? There are And the third point is that there are some cases where that data should not be shared. There's some very like detailed data that are quite private for businesses for good reasons they cannot release. In these cases, we think it kind of falls upon the ONS to sort of explain what they think is happening, right? Like obviously if we cannot access the data, if they can have a sort of just like, okay, this is what we think is happening, it will be helpful. Like because again, just because trends are different doesn't make them wrong. We just need to know what is causing it and how confident we are in it.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so we're just coming towards a close. As I said, we've covered quite a bit. We've had lots of great questions, trying to get through quite a few of them. So thank you for those. You can get the work that we published today on the website, centreforcities.org, plus all the related materials just from our own end. So we'll be doing a bit more work to dig deeper into what's going on in our big cities, particularly the components. So trying to get under the skin of the GVA component and the labour input component, just to try and figure out what is actually going on from a data point of view. We'll also be broadening out the analysis to include medium-sized cities and smaller cities, so to paint and to fill in the full urban landscape of what's going on. And we'll have something to say about that in the relatively near future as well. And then, as I say, we're very keen to support and work with the ONS to actually, figure out how we can best improve the current situation. So we'll be doing quite a lot on this. And as I say, if there are other thoughts that strike you from listening to us or from reading the report, stuff that we could actively be doing, then please do get in touch as always with us, because we're keen to hear from you. But for now, thank you to Yunze and Ant for their thoughts, and for Yunze going through the presentation and providing good insights into what we've done. Thank you for being with us. But until the next time.